Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Nicole Silva, a member of our strategic engagement team here at UC Santa Cruz. Our university forum focuses on the relevance of our research to the community and to social, economic, environmental, and political issues. The university forum proudly features the impact of research conducted by the faculty of UC Santa Cruz. Tonight's speaker is Professor Rob Fairlie, speaking on the early stage of impacts of COVID-19 on small business owners in the United States. Before we begin, I would like to share a few details about the event tonight. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function. We will have the opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program, and we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. And tonight's event will be recorded. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Institute for Social Transformation here at UC Santa Cruz for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Joining us now is tonight's moderator, Professor Laura Giuliano. She is a professor of economics here at UC Santa Cruz. She received a bachelor's of economics from the University of Virginia, and before moving on to receive a master's degree in international relations from Yale University and a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. Professor Giuliano specializes in labor economics and education, but her research interest also extends to personnel and applied econ metrics. Prior to joining UC Santa Cruz in 2018, Professor Giuliano has held teaching positions at UC Berkeley, the University of Miami, the University of Virginia, UC Merced, and was on the Council of Economic Advisors as senior economist under the Obama presidential administration. Welcome, Professor Giuliano.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to moderate the talk. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Rob Fairlie, and I really look forward to discussing this very important topic. So I want to say a few words about Rob before turning it over to him. Rob Fairlie is a professor of economics here at UC Santa Cruz, and his research spans a broad range of topics, including entrepreneurship, education, information technology, inequality, labor economics, and immigration. He's published over 70 journal articles and book chapters, 2 academic books, and numerous government and foundation reports. Rob received his PhD and MA from Northwestern University and received his bachelor's with honors from Stanford University. He came to UC Santa Cruz as an assistant professor straight from his PhD, but since then he's also held visiting positions at Yale University, UC Berkeley, Australian National University, and the Institute for the Study of Labor. In addition to carrying out very policy relevant research, Rob has also dedicated an impressive amount of time to ensure that his research findings help to inform policy. He's testified to the US Senate, the US House of Representatives, the Department of Treasury, and the California State Assembly, where he received a joint resolution from the California legislature. So this evening, he'll be telling us about his latest research on the early impacts of COVID-19 on small business owners in the US. And I know we're all looking forward to this. So on that note, I will turn the screen over to Rob.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. What I would like to do is I'm going to try to share my screen here, and then I can get started. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see the screen here. What I'm going to do is talk about the early stage impacts of COVID-19 on small business owners in the US. This is a research project that I started pretty much in the beginning of the pandemic, because I knew that there would be a release of a data set that could be very useful for trying to understand what was going to happen. And I tried to get a good handle on what was happening from the very beginning. So just to give you some background on the topic that I'm interested in. So stores, factories, other businesses have closed down by policy mandates around the country. There have also been downward demand shifts from customers being concerned about health and also just safety in general about going to stores. And there are lots of other factors that are shutting down businesses right now. What's interesting though is that we don't really know that much about the early effects of COVID-19 on small businesses because it's really difficult to get data. There's just few data sets out there that track small businesses. There are few data sets out there that track entrepreneurs. And especially trying to get timely data. So data that's released very quickly is very important. Often what you find is that there are data sets out there, but it takes 1 to 2 years, and it's extremely frustrating because something like COVID-19 is happening so quickly, and it started so soon, so recently, that we really want to get a handle on what's happening right now. So in this project, I was interested in 3 main questions. So the first is, how large are the early stage impacts of COVID-19 on small businesses? Were there disproportionate effects on female, minority, and immigrant businesses? And what contributed to disproportionate effects, if there are any? So I'll give you a sense as I'm going through the data, how everything I'm looking at is kind of related to these 3 main research questions. So I can't launch into showing you a lot of results until I give you some background on the data set that I'm using. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau kind of combine efforts to measure unemployment in the US economy. So you'll notice that every month there's a Friday report that's coming out this Friday actually for July data on the employment situation of the US. And there's a household measure of unemployment that you hear a lot about. And that's the measure that is that I'm using the actual underlying microdata. So what I do is I go in to their webpage, I download the microdata, and I use it to analyze another question that's asked on that survey, which is, are you a business owner? So in addition to being asked, are you unemployed right now, there's a question asking whether or not you're an active business owner. And that's what I do, or that's what I use. So there's a very rapid release on this. The April 2020 data that covers April 15th was released on May 13th. So I was able to get this very quickly and study it, within less than a month of when it was released. And the information that I have is really useful because it captures all business owners, which includes unincorporated businesses, incorporated businesses, employer businesses, and non-employer businesses. So the entire range of business owners that you see. And the other thing that I'm able to look at is active business owners. I don't know if they've temporarily closed their business or if they permanently closed it, but I know if they're active in that business. And that's kind of the key thing that we're interested in knowing is, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on that activity? So just to give some sense of the timeline before I share the results, March 11th was a key date. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. March 16th, San Francisco Bay Area was the first one to impose kind of extensive shelter-in-place restrictions. The state of California soon followed on March 19th. New York State followed the next day. And then numerous states started to impose social distancing restrictions, closing off of non-essential businesses, and lots of other restrictions that came up. And so by early April, that was kind of the first time when we saw this kind of widespread shutdowns. So if you look at the data here, it's pretty clear what's happening is business ownership is actually relatively steady, even over the business cycle. So one of the things that you see is that it's about 15 million small business owners in the US. That fluctuates a little bit. You can see a trend downwards to about 14 million, then a drift back up to about 15 million. And then all of a sudden, in 1 month, April 2020, we see a drop all the way down to 12 million. So that's a loss from 15 million of 3 million business owners in the US. I look back over time, I've done research all the way back to the 1910 census. There's never in the history of the US been such a sharp drop in the number of active business owners. So it's very striking, it's very clear, it's very alarming. And it's something that I wanted to do a little more research on in terms of, what are the impacts? How do they look across different groups? So the first thing that I wanted to look at is trying to get a handle on how much work activity the owners have. So the way I'm measuring this is there any activity at all? So if a business owner devoted 1 hour or more of work to their business, then I'm calling them an active business owner. If they're inactive, that is defined as they are not working during that week in the month that I'm looking at. So for example, I'm looking at April. So based on that definition, what you can see is from February 2020 to April 2020, there was a 22% drop in the number of active business owners. So again, this was the largest drop ever in terms of the total number and certainly in terms of the percentage. I don't actually look at March, just as kind of a side note, because March had some small effects as states were beginning to impose restrictions, as customers were beginning to become more concerned about health hazards of shopping at small businesses and going to restaurants. And so that is why I'm going to focus all of the analysis on February to April, and then I will be able to show you some of the latest data that I have, which is for May and June. Now, I can also define this as more work effort. So I include a measure of 15 hours or more of work effort. And there I'm actually showing a bigger drop in a business activity of 28% from February to April. And then if I turn this up even higher, so I say, well, no, to be an active business owner, you have to work 30 or more hours in your business, then I see an even larger drop of 31%. So the point I'm trying to make here is essentially that I'm going to use the most conservative definition, which is just that they have to work 1 or more hours. If I were using these more restrictive definitions here, what you'd see is you'd have even bigger impacts on the number of small business owners that are inactive. Another one that's really interesting to look at is unincorporated businesses versus incorporated businesses. Often, incorporated businesses are the ones that are more successful, the more growth-oriented, and even for this group of small business owners, we see a 20% drop. So it's not just that what we're finding is a lot of unincorporated businesses are the ones that are being shut down in April because of COVID, but also it's these incorporated ones that are more growth-oriented, more likely to hire employees. They're also being shut down during this month. Now, when I turn to the demographics, which is one of the kind of most important parts of the research project that I was working on, is there were disproportionate impacts. So the first disproportionate impact I found is that female small business owners were more likely to shut down. So 25% of them shut down in April, whereas for male business owners, 20% dropped. Turning to race was a really important finding. I found that among African-American small business owners, 41% shut down in April. For Latinx business owners, 32% shut down. And for Asian American business owners, I found that 26% shut down. So for all minority groups, I found higher levels or higher percentages of shutting down small business owners than for non-minorities. So for example, I don't show it in this graph, but for white non-Latinx business owners, I found a shutdown rate of 17% over this period of time. The African American or Black-owned business number was one that, as I'll come back to and talk a little bit more towards the end of the talk, was something that got an enormous amount of attention. And part of this was because of the Black Lives Matter movement and this extreme concern over shopping at Black businesses, supporting Black businesses, and actually finally doing something about inequality. And so, I'll mention some of what has come out of that, but that's an extremely alarming number. 41% of Black-owned businesses stopped within a 1-month period. And I'll show you somewhat of the rebound in May and June, but certainly these disproportionate impacts were very concerning. Now, when I focus on immigrant versus US born or native, I also see disproportionate impacts. So very large drop in the number of immigrant business owners over this period of time. 36% of small business owners who are immigrants shut down compared to 18% for natives. Now, what does this imply for unemployment overall? So one of the interesting things from my research and others' research is that what you tend to find is that among small businesses, employees are usually local residents. So, and this is really important when you look at immigrant businesses and minority-owned businesses, that those employees of the businesses tend to be from the same local area. So that means that they tend to be more likely like themselves. So for example, Black-owned businesses tend to hire more African Americans in their businesses. And so in another research project, I'm looking at the disproportionate impacts by race specifically. And what we found is that there were much larger jumps in the number of Black unemployment rates and Latinx unemployment rates than for any other group. And some of the measures that we look at, it was extremely large. So from February to April, we found a jump in terms of unemployment all the way to 30% among African Americans and among Latinx. And so that's that project. We're still working on it, but there's also a lot of concern there that, that there were disproportionate impacts in terms of that. Okay, so business owners are not important just for their owners, but they're also important for the employees that they hire, which are also co-ethnics. Now, when we switch over to industry, as you'd expect, there are going to be big differences across industries. So for example, agriculture, there wasn't much of an impact because it was deemed an essential business. Construction, there was a 27% drop. The industries, though, that found the biggest drops were personal and laundry services. So these kind of like real high contact types of small businesses. There was an 80% drop over this 2-month period. Another one is arts, leisures, and hotels. We saw a major shutdown there, 35%. Restaurant dropped 22%. So one thing to think about with restaurants is the actual activity levels drop even more than that. It's just that the business owners were probably still active in kind of trying to run their restaurant, trying to do takeout, trying to do some catering. So I'm not able to measure the loss in revenues of all of these businesses. And that's, I think in a way, I'm actually, well underestimating what is actually going on here. So keep that in mind too, is I can only look at the activity of the business owner, and that activity is defined entirely by their work effort. Now, industry is important because we know that different demographic groups, female-owned businesses, for example, Black-owned businesses, they concentrate in different industries than non-minority-owned businesses. And so what I looked at is I did some simulations where I tried to figure out how much or what part of the gap in these disproportionate impacts was due to industry. So was it the case that female-owned businesses, for example, were disproportionately hit because of COVID-19, because of the industries that those businesses are in? And I did find some evidence for that. I also found that Black-owned businesses were partly hit harder because of the industries that they're in, same for Latinx, and the same for Asian-owned businesses. Now, industry was important. I'm not going to argue that it wasn't, but I think that one of the most important factors that happen is the scale of the business. For example, minority-owned businesses tend to be smaller scale. So a good example might be a restaurant. There are a number of fast food restaurants out there that never shut down during COVID-19. They continue to operate. Well, they have corporate headquarters telling them how to adjust to COVID-19, how to keep the drive-through windows operating. Whereas if you're a small business, often owned by minorities in a small restaurant, they had a much harder time adjusting to all the health regulations, to adjusting to making customers feel safe. They often don't have a drive-through window. They often have a small space inside or outside in which to serve customers. And so you can imagine the scale of the business was essential in terms of being able to stay open. And I think that that was one of the biggest factors for why so many minority businesses had to shut down during this period of time. Now, I also was able to get May and June data, so the latest data there available. And I wanted to know, was there a rebound? Because we know that a lot of small businesses started to reopen again as the social distancing restrictions were lifted, and also as other restrictions on businesses being open or not were restricted. So what you can see here is a graph. I continue the graph that I showed you before that showed that unprecedented drop in April. And you can see that there actually was a rebound, a partial rebound in May, and a partial rebound in June that continued in June. So let's look at those numbers a little more carefully. This shows you exactly what's happening in more detail. So from February to April, there was a 22% drop. From February to May, there was a 15% drop. So we found actually a 7 percentage point rebound, partial rebound from April to May. And then you can see there's even another 7 percentage point partial rebound to June. So now looking at June compared to February, only 8% of small businesses are inactive. Now, does this mean this is really good news and we should be happy that these businesses are restarted or at least active again? Well, one thing is we need to look at the disproportionate impacts by ethnic and racial group. But another thing that I think that I worry that this hides is that this still represents lost income for these business owners over this period of time. They continue to have to pay their expenses. So one of the most important being their rental properties, or maybe if they have to pay mortgages on their businesses or the business building that they have. And so if the revenues are dropping, which they certainly are during this period of time, even though they're active in terms of starting up those businesses again in June, they still have lost an enormous amount of revenues over this period of time. And that's something that we will probably find out more about later as that type of data becomes more available. Okay, well, let's look at the disproportionate impacts. So what we see is that the drop was higher for female business owners, and there was a rebound for both female and male business owners. The rebound for female business owners was comparable to male business owners, but it left them in a position in June that was still lower in terms of percentage than for male. Similar for African American, Latinx, and Asian business owners. Is one way to look at this is there was a rebound for all three groups. Another way to look at it is levels in May and June were also disproportionately lower than they were for non-minority owned businesses. And so when we add up those losses to revenues, they will be extremely large. Same for immigrant versus native. We see this big drop for immigrants in April, a partial rebound in May and a partial rebound in June, but the main kind of finding here is that there was still a lower level in June, at least disproportionately relative to US-born business owners. So what are some of the conclusions that I can draw from this? One is that there was this large drop in business owners in April, and the data that I provided was some of the first evidence provided on this in the US. There were disproportionate effects on female, minority, and immigrant businesses. The finding of a loss of 41% of active business owners in April was just striking and stunning and obviously very disconcerting. The partial rebound in May and June for all groups is interesting, but we need to keep in mind the lost business income and continued expenses over this time. So even though there was a partial rebound in activity, that doesn't mean there was a full rebound or even partial rebound for that matter in terms of revenues. And that's very important. There also certainly were job losses for co-ethnics. In the kind of parallel project on unemployment, we're finding huge negative effects that have not dropped nearly as much in May and June for several different minority groups. And then another thing to keep in mind is reopening businesses is promising in the sense that for the business owners and maybe the jobs that they're creating, but there are huge trade-offs here for health, right? We're seeing yet another big spike in terms of COVID cases. So July seems to be much higher than what we saw in June and earlier months. And that's a real concern, is that what is the cost of reopening these businesses in terms of our health? And we don't know how that's going to play out. We also don't know how, a future recession is going to play out. If these businesses are going to be active again in, August, September, October, we have no sense of like how long this is going to last. And certainly the increase in cases is very worrisome. So what is actually happening on the policy side? That's another area that I'm very interested in. There have been PPP loans. Over $600 billion has been pushed into those loans. I now have access actually to all the data for all of the loans that were given out. There were 5.5 million loans. And I'm actually trying to do some new research on that to see if there were disproportionate loans to various groups. So one big concern is that a lot of minority-owned businesses were not given access to those loans. And so that's something that I want to study. Stimulus checks were another not exactly a direct payment for business owners, but they certainly could have helped in terms of business owners making their payments. Private firms and also foundations have really stepped up. There have been a number of different programs out there. Some interesting ones are PayPal has kind of teamed up with the AO organization. Magic Johnson Enterprises has contributed. Beyonce actually has a song that she's using to help support Black-owned businesses and provide grants. And Google, Facebook also have come up with new kind of programs to really help support minority-owned businesses. Another interesting thing is that there has been some recent Senate testimony that has actually used the results of my research, and that has been very useful in terms of their arguments for this kind of buy Black movement. So I don't know if you've seen the lists that have come around on Black-owned businesses in different local areas that has really been pushed hard. The Senate testimony has talked a lot about how this is disproportionately impacting minority business owners and how the Senate needs to do something about it. And so what was really quite interesting is that they were using a lot of the estimates that I've produced and that I've just shown you, especially the 41% of Black-owned businesses shutting down in April. But that was one of the numbers, the facts that really resonated among senators. And it was very interesting to learn very recently that there is a new Senate bill out there to try to do something about this, to try to put more resources into the Minority Business Development Agency and actually have more of a regional approach to this. And it was supported by Senators Cardin, Schumer, Harris, Booker, and other senators. So that was really interesting. Hopefully this will lead to kind of longer term changes and more attention to these issues. So I would like to close there. And of course, we're going to open it up to questions and hopefully also have some discussion. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Rob. That was really interesting. And we have lots of good questions to follow up. The first question actually is someone who wants to see the paper and is working on related topics. So there's already, you've got some co-authors out there already. But let me go to, I think the first question was about the location, I guess they're asking about the geographic variation, which is, I think, something that maybe I'll add to this question a bit, is that were you able to explore the role of geographic variation in shutdowns and how that might have played into some of these differences?
Yeah, so that's one of the things. I wasn't able to explore it as carefully as I wanted to. I did look at regions across the country, and one of the areas of the country that was shut down the least was, in the South, which does kind of correlate with different minority business owners. But when I looked at this kind of carefully, statistically, I didn't find evidence of that. So when I looked at it state by state, I just didn't find their kind of clear pattern. One of the things I was hoping to do was look at the social distancing restrictions that were in place and try to see if that's correlated with what is happening in the reopening part of it. And there is definitely some relationship there, but it didn't seem to be correlated with demographics. So I think that, I might do more work on that, but I don't have like a definitive answer.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I think that would be, it might have some policy implications if there were some correlation there. I wonder if population density would be a different angle to look at. So let's see. I guess there are a few follow-up questions just about the role of industry, and you said a bit about that. So people are wondering whether this also explains some of the differential rebound. So you talked about the role of industry in the shutdowns, and a related question, let me just scroll down here, is whether you think it has something, whether it has to do with some industries being more challenging to reopen. I guess another way of asking that would be, do you think that to some extent it has to do with challenges of reopening versus legal restrictions? I've wondered in particular whether the gender effect is really driven a lot by personal care and businesses that weren't even allowed to reopen if they could.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the industries that's not reopened very quickly, is personal services. So construction's one where you see a little bit more of a rebound. Certainly restaurants, you see more of a rebound. But I think that those kind of smaller scale service type industries where there are lots and lots of small business owners, those are having a much harder time kind of, attracting customers, trying to figure out the regulations, that keep changing. And, they're small businesses. They're often not franchises like what you see with like a McDonald's or a Burger King, where you have a corporate headquarters that can tell you, okay, here are the rules, here's what you need to do to satisfy them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I hadn't seen that mentioned a lot, so I think that's really important. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about what we can do to prevent this in the future? I guess that's sort of a general question related to what do you think will be the long-term effects of these business closings? Do you think that a lot of them will disappear, or will they be able to recover? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. That is kind of like the $1,000,000 question.
It is. Absolutely.
If we continue to see increases in the number of COVID cases, we're not going to be able to reopen the economy that quickly. You know, we need people to be very careful about social distancing and worry about it. We don't really know what's going to happen with recession. I think the chair of the federal board basically said, maybe it was a couple weeks ago, that he expects unemployment to remain very high, even all the way to January. I think in the 10% or maybe 9% level. So that suggests that we're not going to see this quick recovery that we would hope to see.
Well, I think it's really important to, that's an honest answer, that we don't really know, and that clearly the pandemic has everything to do with this. So yeah, it depends a lot on that, right?
That could help is, the policy response has been pretty strong. We're seeing, $600 billion spent on the PPP program, and who knows, maybe even more in the future. That's a huge amount of money.
Again, this is a tough question, a big question, but people want to know if you can share a bit about, or a bit more about, what Congress is considering and what you hope it will accomplish. Or what do you think they should do, maybe?
Well, one of the things that this Senate bill, so this is kind of the first Senate bill that's really being pushed in response to the concerns about these numbers, of this big drop in the number of minority-owned businesses. What they're trying to do is establish, permanent funding for the Minority Business Development Agency, which is part of Department of Commerce, that really goes out there and tries to help specifically minority-owned businesses, to try to help them with legal issues, with marketing issues, with obtaining loans from the Small Business Administration, trying to figure out the PPP program, all of those kinds of help that are really useful, right, in terms of small businesses being able to function and survive. Another aspect that they're trying to push is kind of have a regional approach. So typically the MBDA has been more at the federal level, and to have regional offices. And that could be extremely important, because you could think of the problems that small businesses face, say in Dallas, Texas, are very different than the problems that they face in Minneapolis, Minnesota, right? And so, that could be really useful. Like those separate offices might be able to say, okay, well, we need to get funding here. We need to apply for these SBA loans for these industries more, and really be able to adjust more quickly.
Right. So a related question is about whether, or to the extent to which difficulty accessing and receiving federal assistance has been a driver of the disparate impact. And I was wondering too about whether the conditions for receiving the stimulus, in some cases required you to have, to maintain to pay your employees, or to stay active. And that, I guess it's, you can imagine there could be different reasons why minorities would have more difficulty accessing federal assistance. Have you been able to look at that at all, or is there?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that you had to have an established relationship with a bank. The banks kind of reached out to those businesses first, the ones that they work with the most. And you can imagine a lot of minority-owned businesses did not have that established relationship with the bank, because they're much less likely to get loans in the first place. And then there was just outrage when we found out that the Los Angeles Lakers received a PPP loan that was supposedly for small businesses. I don't know if you remember in the news, right? Potbelly Sandwiches was another one that received a loan. Now, these organizations paid it back, but there are also new ones that have come up. There was big outrage over Tom Brady has some kind of sports equipment store that brands his, and he also, his business received a loan. And so here's someone who's, worth millions of dollars getting a PPP loan, and a lot of small businesses being kind of shut out of it, especially minority-owned businesses. And there's been certainly a lot of outrage over that. Now, what's changed is in the latest kind of PPP loans, they have tried to go out to more community banks and get those community banks in those local areas to try to find exactly the types of small businesses that were left out in the first place. So I don't know how much of that's happened, right? It's been very difficult to analyze the data. One of the most frustrating things that I've found is I was able to get all of the data is that there's only information for about 10% of the loans on the race of the owner. And so one of the things the federal government did is they didn't collect it. And so it was kind of left open to the banks to collect this information. If they wanted to write it down, they did. If they didn't, or they didn't know that they should, they didn't. And so it was only 10% of cases where you actually have that information. So it's a huge problem, right? We don't really even know who, what types of businesses got these loans. And of course, these few stories that come out about the outrage of these larger businesses has really undermined the trust in the federal government to do this program.
Let me go to another question here. Switching topics a bit. I guess going back to your definition of work, or it's not really yours, but how it's asked. This is as someone asking, as a small business owner of 40 years, we work a lot, but it's often marketing or administration that doesn't directly create revenue. Do you know, what can you say about the definition of work and how people might have responded to it if they literally weren't making any revenue, but we're still working?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point to bring up. I mentioned it briefly in my talk, but I think it's a very good one to reiterate here, is I'm only measuring their work activity. That work activity could be for marketing. It could even be just trying to figure out the red tape in terms of being able to operate. So all of these activities might be non-revenue generating in the short run or even in the long run, right? So that's one of the key things is all I can look at is the activity of the owner in terms of how much they work. That is actually how the data set that I use is set up. It's set up to look at work activity. But I think that, that's where we really don't know how many of these are permanent closures, how many of these businesses have lost all of their revenues, even with the business being activity or the business owners still being active. We don't know. There's no way to know that.
Yeah. Sort of related, are you able to say anything about the other sources of income for these individuals, for self-employed people in general, how that breaks down by race and gender? Do you have any idea how many of them are operating small businesses on the side? They have other jobs?
Oh, so that's another good question. The actual information that I'm using is only business owners where it's their main job activity. So for example, someone who's an Uber driver but works at, say, Costco, that person would not be considered a business owner in my data set. Okay. So using the measure I'm using, there are 15 million business owners in the US, or there were back in February. If you used a much broader definition of anyone who has any kind of business activity, which could be consulting, could be contract work, it could be an Uber driver, then that number jumps up to well over 25 million. Because there are a lot of people that are doing kind of side businesses or have consulting income or activities. And based on the Census Bureau's definition, they are business owners, they're business activities, but I'm not actually measuring that here. I'm only measuring this as their main job.
Okay, good. Thanks for that clarification. We had a question about the impacts on world economy and trade, which is interesting because many, you've talked a lot about the service sector was, most of the decline was in services, but it's interesting to think about the impact that these small businesses may have with trade partners.
Yeah,
Could
I
there
think that's
potentially be
a I mean, a lot of small businesses do not trade outside of their local areas. I mean, that's one of the things that protects them actually
Yeah.
from global
Mm-hmm.
issues, that these are non-tradable goods that they're producing or services. And so in a way, you know, they're not as impacted by kind of major changes in markets. But on the flip side, of course they are, right? Because that has effects on the economy overall. It affects on consumers, their ability to spend, their confidence in spending money. And so I think that can be really important. The data set that I'm working at has no information on trade, unfortunately.
Right.
It would be really interesting to be able to look at that. I have looked at other data sets, and one really interesting finding is that another contribution of immigrant business owners in the US economy is they actually have much higher levels of trade to countries, often to their home countries, of course. But that's important because that generates revenues that are coming in from other sources into And so it's been used as another argument for why immigrant-owned businesses are contribute a lot to the U.S. economy.
Oh, that's very interesting. Do you think, and this is again another related question, whether the customer base differences in the income of the customer bases could partly explain the differences in hours worked and these disparities in the decline and rebound of the small businesses?
Yeah, I think that's another important one, is that's also very difficult to measure, of course, but I think it's probably very important too, is if you're located in a poor area, you're going to see kind of a bigger drop off in customer demand. One of the things that we're seeing, looking at the data pretty carefully now, is highly educated, highly skilled workers were often not laid off, right? Because they could do their work from home. And of course, that includes professors, right? We were able to continue to teach our classes. We're able to continue to do our research. And so those areas where you found those customers, right, they're still purchasing goods, they're still buying things. Now, what has shifted though is a lot of that, a lot of concern about that being shifted over to online purchases and not so much local businesses, but still there has to be kind of more of an impact there. It's just, as I mentioned, it's not something that's easy to measure because business owners often don't know all of their customers or what percent of their customers are local, what percent of their customers are coming out of town or maybe on their commute line. That's just something they wouldn't know. And so we really don't, in general, have a lot of good information on it.
Another technical question about how, let's see, does the BLS incorporate revenue and net income from Treasury in their data? I guess that means, yeah.
Yeah, one of the biggest limitations is I don't have the revenues of the businesses. But one of the things that I've been working with is I have a contact that works at Gavin Newsom's office. And so she's been contacting me to get updates of my data, but focused specifically for California. And so there's been a big push in the governor's office in California to promote buying locally, buying smart, obviously like for health reasons. And so one of the things that we were trying to look into is if there's a way to get California data at least on maybe sales taxes or revenues and try to be able to match that maybe to the PPP loans or something like that, or at least get some sense of what's happening there. And I think that's what it's going to take, is I think it's going to involve using an outside data set, not the data set that I'm using here for the results that I just showed you, but something else. And I'm expecting the drops in revenues to be much, much higher than what I'm showing. And unfortunately, I also expect it to be more disproportionate.
Yeah.
The female-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, immigrant-owned businesses are probably going to see bigger revenue hits. And part of it's just because, when the scale of your business is larger, you're more able to adjust to these issues. For example, I know, for example, Target has not closed, right? A lot of these bigger stores have not, whereas the real small businesses, that sell different goods and services, they were shut down. And it's just a lot harder for them to adjust, a lot harder for them to, to be able to satisfy customers at this point in time.
They can't just have people order online as easily. Yeah, that's a big difference. Here's an interesting question. The small businesses which believed the loans in the PPP were forgivable, but later determined that they're not. Are you following this issue? I anticipate potentially disastrous results. What do you have any thoughts about this issue?
Another kind of big question. I won't call that one $1 million question, but certainly an important question. We don't know. I mean, it seems like the government is telling us something new, every week on forgiveness of these loans, on the rules of the loans, if you satisfy the loans. I know the SBA is very involved in this, and they're trying to figure out, maybe we should have different programs for different size of businesses and for different, levels of employment. I guess my most honest answer here is we really just don't know. It's quite possible that if businesses can show that they re-employed these former workers, that they will be forgiven. But again, I don't know. Difficult to read question.
A few of these are coming back to things that I think you've covered. Where do you see the world economy going in the next year? This is not a small question, but despite national sex, ethnic, or immigration status, the fraction of the economy represented by small business. How much, I guess, so what fraction of the overall economy is represented by small business? And I guess what's the impact of the decline in small business on the economy overall, in proportional terms?
Well, I guess there are different ways to look at this. If you look at it in terms of revenues, small businesses are, a small share. You've got massive corporations like Walmart and Microsoft that just kind of dominate in terms of revenues. In terms of employment, it's a little bit lower, right? Because it's, a lot of the workers are spread around to different businesses. But I don't know if that's the best way to look at it. Every business owner is creating a job for him or herself, right? That's important. Those jobs that are being created as a business owner are important. They're often in local communities. They have impacts. They have impacts for wealth. They have impacts for income, savings. And so, in general, if we look at like levels of inequality, they are important for determining that, and they're a contributor to inequality. What you tend to find that I didn't have time to show you is that you see lower rates of business ownership, especially among African Americans and Latinx. And that business ownership level being lower is contributing to income inequality. It's contributing especially to wealth inequality. Business owners tend to generate more wealth. And then when you think about the local jobs that they create, that's also important. So it's hard to kind of come up with an actual number. Another thing that I think is important, just kind of stepping away from the disproportionate impacts by groups, is another value of small businesses that's often overlooked is their value in terms of creating a vibrant downtown. So for example, when you walk around downtown, like if you walk around Santa Cruz, it's vibrant, right? There are these small businesses, these shops, restaurants, little stores. You wouldn't have those if all we had were corporations that own chains, and all we had were malls. And so that's extremely important. That's what makes walking around New York City so fun, or walking around downtown Chicago, is seeing all these different small businesses that are owned by a huge, diverse group of people and offering all kinds of different goods and services that they're selling. So I think that also has extremely high value that we don't often think of. And it's hard to put a number, a value on it, right? But it's certainly something that if you asked almost anyone, they would say, oh yeah, that is really valuable to me.
Thanks for making that point. I think as economists, sometimes we tend to focus on just a certain measurable set of things, employment and dollars, and but these, it's other things are maybe a bit harder to measure, but that doesn't make them less valuable. So that's a really good point. And you also touched on another question that came up about the effect on wealth inequality, which I think is also important to think about. Even though that's not in the data, it's clear that differences in business ownership would affect that. So we got another question as we were talking. Could consumers stay in place behavior during this pandemic push Amazon further toward having monopolies over certain markets? And I think you were speaking to that too. I guess, do you want to say anything more about small businesses versus Amazon, and whether this could just, whether the market power issue could just make it that much more difficult for the businesses to get back in once this is all over?
Market power. I think that customers could start to change their behavior. Right, there are a lot of people that might have been reluctant to buy online because they're worried about security, or they're just not real familiar with, clicking through and looking for products. And as they become more familiar with it, then it becomes easier, right? And so it might be harder to kind of come back to an old world where, oh yeah, I have to get my car and I have to drive down to a store. Like, for example, in Santa Cruz, you drive down to 41st, where there are a lot of stores, right? And they might not want to do that anymore. So there's definitely a lot of concern over that what it's going to do is change customer behavior, not just in April, May, and June, and for the next couple months, but this could be a longer term factor. And so, unfortunately, these bigger kind of tech companies might actually benefit more from it than the small businesses, and it might even hurt the small businesses overall.
That is a great point. Yeah, I know I couldn't see myself using Instacart before now.
Yeah.
Wow. So let's see. So a specific policy question about California. Do you think it would be wise for California to extend the now expired federal bump of $600 a week, since some small businesses like mine are not allowed to open now? The business in question is, I'm a convention speaker. Yeah, so that's something that's still affected by the regulations. So do you think that extending the unemployment bump in California would be a good solution to that?
I think that the federal government and the state of California are going to have to do something. They're going to have to come up with some programs, right? I mean, I mentioned before that there have been private companies that have tried to come in and help small business owners, and mentioned, some specific individuals who've been involved in this. But the truth is that's just a small, scale relative to what's really needed and what might be needed in the future. We just, we don't really know how long this is going to last. And if it lasts a long time, the government, is not going to be able to provide unlimited funds. So that's another big concern is, kind of government debt on all of this. But at least in the short run, certainly small business owners, unemployed workers are going to need a lot of help. And if they don't receive that help, we could see a bigger, reduction in the economy, as individuals will not be able to spend money. And what's kind of a bigger concern is the disruptions that'll be created. If we start to see defaults on mortgages, late payments, we could see kind of a rash of bankruptcy filings. And that also will be, very problematic economically.
Well, I think you just summed it up. You answered the last question, which was, will this COVID crisis create a significant redistribution of market share and wealth? And I think it's clearly there's a lot of uncertainty, but as you said, a concern that there could be sort of a domino effect of these things. Was there anything else you'd like to add to that before we call that the last question? It's been a very interesting conversation and great answers.
Yeah, no, thank you for, having me on, and thank everyone for participating in this. I think that, these are unprecedented times, and I think we're all going to have to kind of work together to try to figure out solutions. And that's going to involve, getting very involved, voting, obviously, getting involved in government, writing, emailing Congress or local policymakers and trying to express your opinion on what to do. And then obviously the other part of it is customers. We also have some power here. Supporting these small businesses is going to be important right now to be able to make sure that they survive. I certainly personally will really miss if we do lose our vibrant economies, in local downtowns. I think that that's something that I value a lot. I've already noticed starting to see some business closures, and that's kind of worrisome if we see like empty storefronts. It's not just not having the vibrant community and the vibrant business sector, but it's also, there's something very disconcerting when you start to see boarded up windows or you just see empty buildings. It changes your feeling. It changes how optimistic you are about what's happening. So anyway, I hope that we can kind of rebound from this quickly. Maybe that's being overly optimistic, but I sure hope that we can.
Thank you so much for your talk tonight. It was really interesting. A little nervous about it, but it's a good message to maybe shop local and support our small businesses where we can. So thank you so much for speaking tonight. Thank you, Professor Giuliano, for moderating, and thank you everyone for making time to join us. Please join us Thursday, August 27th for our next CRAW lecture, Hunting for Infection, One Molecule at a Time, with Professor Holger Schmidt. Thanks so much.
Thank you.